I've been starting to think about this lately, and I've come to this theory. So let me bounce it off of you, and you tell me what you think. You know, companies that are just beginning the open source journey, those that are advocates of open source inside of the company are saying you really should use this stuff. It's really worthwhile. It's as secure as everything else. You should really use this stuff. And then they have success, and so the company starts to use that code. And then shortly after that, they go, well, you needed to make these changes or you found these bugs. You should contribute those back. You should contribute those back. And there's resistance and resistance. No, I don't want to do that. No, I'm going to work just on my stuff. So, eventually, finally, that bug fix, they finally contributed back, and okay, good. And then, well, we wanted this feature, and we shouldn't just do this feature. We should try to work with the community and get that feature pushed upstream, because that's value to them, and we should do that as good community members. And so, the advocate pushes for that, and finally, the company says yes. And then the guy goes, okay, well, now you've contributed all these things, but this is actually additional overhead for the project. So you should help review all the other code as well. So it's like every time you convince the company to do something in open source, it leads to another thing that they have to do more of. And so if I'm a manager, who's been walking this journey over time, it's like, when does this incessant need of these open source projects ever end for me? Now, you and I and Ildiko, we know the other side of that, and we've just talked about it. But if I put my empathy hat on for those poor managers in the companies, that's what they've been seeing. And I'm curious, what is your take on that view of the world?
Well, we actually had this discussion a lot at Google. Kubernetes was exactly that. TensorFlow, to some degree, is that. Prometheus, even though it wasn't our project, is that.
Right.
Because these things now become these commercial things we depend on. And so the arguments were very similar. We got all these people working on open source upstream, and then we have high-paying customers that would like things to be done in the managed service, right? We did the value, right? We put the value where it belongs, in the service and the manageability, and not necessarily in the software. And so the customer's like, yo, where is that IAM integration? Where is that custom encryption key integration stuff? And it's like, well, we're working on upstream. So the minute the manager hears that, it's like, whoa. We need to rebalance these resources, right? Because if you're telling me you can't do the thing that literally pays you, I can't justify you all working upstream and this stuff is falling on the wayside because we literally need money to pay you. So it's complicated. And then I think one thing that the team started getting really smart about was being very clear. We are working on the commercial integration. The IAM thing requires hooks inside of Kubernetes so that we can actually manage every aspect of Kubernetes. Because if you layer authorization on top without the core components doing their thing, then it won't work. So this thing we're working on upstream, and the reason why we're reviewing all these other things is because we got to bring those things in. And if they're not secure, and if they're not right, then we're going to be running them in production. So if this new feature causes performance problems, it's going to cause performance problems for us. And then that leads to these other issues. And I think it is on engineering to include open source contributions in the overall roadmap. And I think that transparency helps a manager realize and say, listen, yes, we should contribute to open source. Contribute, not own, right? And we got to balance it out. So if you tell me that we have 60% of these things we need to generate revenue, run the money, and then these 40% contribute to those, then this is easy, right? It's just that some of our works happens upstream. But when you start to show me a feature that we don't need, I think it is fair for a manager to say, hey, look, that's a net new thing. It's a pet project of yours. On your own time, sure. But looking at this list of things you would like to contribute, we like these 8. These 7 don't really align, and you haven't given me justification to really rationalize the allocations we're giving as a company. And I think that is just fair, right? Engineer, manager, and the upstream project. I think what gets in trouble is that we don't communicate our bandwidth allocations upstream, because what happens is big companies end up taking over these projects, right? They get all these contributions, everyone's relying on them, they're doing all of this work, and then they have to need to dial it back for some reason, right? Maybe they have a code red, They need to pivot these people to work on some critical security things so they can remain in business. And then things drop and there's no communication. It's okay to say, listen, we got to start working on some internal stuff for the next 6 months. So our ability to review stuff is going to drop way down. Matter of fact, we're going to recommend a project freeze. I remember when Golang did it. I think I remember when Python was doing it from the transition to 2 to 3. And see, no one wants to hear this kind of stuff. But I do think it's important to say, hey, we don't have the bandwidth right now. So for the next 6 months from January or July to December, we're kind of going freeze mode. So security stuff only, minor bug fixes only, and all features are going to be frozen until next year so we can reassess. In that time, we're going to start training new maintainers.
Yeah.
So if you want to step up and learn these subsystems, it's going to be much easier during the freeze versus when everything is moving around. So this is our plea for help. We don't want to be the bottleneck. And these are just like the nuanced discussions that I don't know if we all have enough. It's like my manager said no, and you just disappear. And it's just crickets on the issues, and then things start getting stale. You got to just communicate. It's like, hey, and don't throw your manager on the bus. So if you're listening to this, I'm not saying you go to your project and say, my manager hates you and open source, and that's why I can't contribute anymore. Don't do that. That's not fair. Just be like, hey, I work for money. And the fair thing to do after some rational discussion is we got to reallocate things. So here's what my participation will be going forward. And to me, even when HashiCorp changed their license, one of the first things I said on Twitter is I appreciated the 10 years of the way HashiCorp has been giving us all of this value for most of y'all for essentially free. You have to appreciate the previous 10 years before you can complain about things going forward. So it's just a balance.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good approach to it. I think it's often the case that those developers, when they are put in that situation, shift to nights and weekends on their own, and that's when you hear so much about the burnout because they do feel so responsible. And it's a parent-child relationship almost, right? You want your baby to survive, and so you want to continue to have it thrive, and you do those reviews outside, and that ultimately is not good for the individuals.
I've
But
seen a
yeah,
lot
I
of
mean,
maintainers do this to themselves. You know, you start getting success and that feedback loop feels good. Thousands of users, GitHub stars are going up. People know your name. People are using your stuff. But then you got to realize that what is your succession plan? You're not going to do this forever. You're not going to want to do this forever. I remember there's a guy named Ben Johnson, and he wrote the first etcd implementation or the RAF implementation used by etcd. And Ben Johnson was just like super popular, especially when Go was just heating up. And I remember he did this new project and he put on the top, I will not be accepting contributions. I know my bandwidth and I don't have bandwidth for this one to be managed like the other ones. So I'm going to publish my stuff here. I'm going to be respectful of lots of backwards compatibility stuff, but I cannot take your feature request. And it was so fair because it was right there in the README. It was right there in the contribution guide. Like, hey, don't go off and do a bunch of stuff and expect me to review and merge it. I'm telling you right now, that's not going to happen. So I think that balance is just super clear and healthy thing to do. And you got to know when to pass the baton.
yeah, yeah, I think it's important. I think it's one of the things that's missing. We need to make sure that the community knows this through messaging time and time again.